great to have you all join us on our second and last day of ARAT. It's gone so quickly already. What an amazing time we've had. And I'm delighted on this day to introduce Matthew Clarke, who is going to be tackling a subject that we haven't really discussed much at ARAT before, shame on us, in changing the behaviour of human traffickers. It also seems very timely with the US State Department tip office out yesterday. A very mixed picture around the world, but for a lot of ASEAN countries, not looking great. So we have still a lot of work to do before us. And what I love about this conference is that it challenges us to think about new ways of doing things. So I'm delighted to have you join us, Matt. I'm going to hand over to you.
Hey, great. Thanks, Helen. Yeah, it has been a good conference so far. So much variety, amazing range of people and a variety of interventions people are actively engaged in our region. It's wonderful to see such a collection of people doing dedicated work for the good of our whole society. So it's great to be here, and welcome to everybody. I hope you've been enjoying the conference as well. I might just check that people are hearing me correctly and seeing the title slide of my PowerPoints. That all okay? Translation working fine? All systems go. So look, as Helen said, this session focuses on an area of anti-trafficking work that is significantly underdeveloped in my opinion, and that's the understanding and engaging the perpetrator's side of the problem, the trafficker's side. It's a controversial reframing that I'm wanting to do here about the goal and the strategy of anti-trafficking work, and I hope that will generate some productive discussion. I understand that, look, any discussion about traffickers, about the abuses, the exploitation and the coercion that they engage in can raise really painful memories for some people and deeply emotional responses to this idea of trying to engage with those people. So please be kind to yourself during this session and kind to each other in your comments. I'm not a great fan of lectures, and so I've tried to do something here in the hour we've got together that's a little bit more interactive as far as the content, the context of Zoom enables. I'm wanting to do something that throws some questions to you, a reverse Q&A, for me to ask you some questions and ask you to give some responses to the whole group. And in doing that, I'm wanting to use a process that I've heard called the reverse order of speaking, and that is, I'd like to ask the people who normally speak first to take a back seat. I'd like to give first opportunity for people to respond to the several questions that I have for you. Give the first opportunity to people who perhaps aren't feeling very confident with English, people who are part of minority groups, people who are introspective, introverted, and often the last to speak. I'd like to invite you to speak first, and for the people who normally speak first to hold off. Now, my talk is going to take follow a 4-stage sequence, and I'm just going to speak very briefly about myself. Who am I? Because most of you don't know me. Then I want to talk about the what's this topic about? What do I mean changing the behaviours of traffickers? Who, how, what is this supposed to be? And then I'll turn to the question of how. If we think this is a good idea, that perhaps we could change the behaviour of traffickers, well, the question is, well, how do we go about it? What would interventions in that area look like? So that's the third section. And then the fourth section, we'll talk about what happens next. Now that we've got these ideas, where do we go from here? So to start with, just a few words about myself. Most of my career is in information technology. I've worked in software development, artificial intelligence. I lectured computer science at universities for 10 years. I've been involved in commercial data analysis and information architecture, and all of that has been across commercial, academic, and not-for-profit NGO space. But all along the way, one of my key concerns has been about international development and peacemaking. I worked with some international development companies, particularly in the area of child poverty. I've been involved in grassroots peacemaking for many, many years, including living in 8 years in South Africa during the end of apartheid and being involved in cross-cultural work to ease the transition out of apartheid. More recently, my wife and I started what we call the Freedom Keys Research Project. That's an initiative that is an independent research project that through which we are hoping to generate innovative ideas for the next 20 years of anti-trafficking work, and then to test the effectiveness of those ideas. And I'll say a little bit more about the Freedom Keys as we go along. That's all I want to say about myself. Happy to answer questions about my own background at another time. So let's turn to the next part, which is what's the topic about? What am I talking about? And so I have a question for you to consider. I wonder what you think the aim of anti-trafficking or anti-slavery work is. How would you complete this sentence? I use the words anti-trafficking and anti-slavery, or human trafficking and modern slavery, interchangeably. There's controversy and limitations to both of those terms, so please bear with me if I swap from one term to the other during the talk. I'm sure with your own involvement in this area, you understand the intricacies, the complexities of the whole social problem. But what would you think if you had to finish this sentence? It's surely something to do with ending or significantly reducing the incidence of human trafficking or modern slavery. It's not about treating the symptoms after the problem, but doing something to actually stop the problem. So rescuing victims and supporting survivors, punishing offenders, auditing supply chains, changing supply and demand dynamics are all very important. But to me, they're not the goal. They're some of the tools that we use, which we hope will lead to the real goal. For me, the real goal is to stop people abusing, exploiting, and coercing other people. And as you know, those abuses, exploitations, and coercions come in many forms across multiple social contexts. So that's a large challenge for us to address all of those. And there's no one solution that's going to fit all different forms of human trafficking. According to the UN's protocol that has guided the movement since 2000, trying to stop people in this space follows the 4 Ps. So we try to do preventative work, we try to protect, we try to prosecute, and we work in partnership. And I think it's questionable whether that approach has actually worked terribly effectively in the last 20 years. I think what's missing is an emphasis on changing the behaviour of the people who perpetrate those abuses, exploitation, and coercion. Now, decreasing people's vulnerability to being exploited is important. Rescuing victims, supporting survivors, prosecuting and punishing offenders. I'm not trying to say that they're unimportant. They're all crucial to the whole movement and to reaching this goal. But none of those interventions directly address this core issue of how do we stop the perpetrators from doing what they're doing. The perpetrator, in fact, often remains invisible in the media reports of human trafficking and also in research coverage. It's as though the perpetrators are some black box that we can't touch, we can't see inside of. We can't expect to see inside this black box. We attempt to put them in jail, we attempt to help their victims, but we rarely look inside. And so the focus of the Freedom Keys Research Project, more than anything else, is to break open that black box so that we can see the internal workings, understand the mind of the perpetrators, make visible their dynamics, their drivers, and having understood it, to then seek to change it. We should be asking questions like, how do we address the vulnerability of people who are at risk of becoming traffickers, just as much as the vulnerability of people to becoming trafficked? How do we prevent that from taking place? How do we prevent people from becoming traffickers in the first place? We should be asking questions like, how do we convince people who are already involved in trafficking that there's a better way? We need to ask, is the threat of punishment effective? We should be asking what can be done to reform and rehabilitate convicted offenders. Now that raises the question, of course, well, who are these people I'm talking about? Who are the people who perpetrate these abuses, exploitation, and coercion? I use the word perpetrator very broadly, but I find it useful to distinguish a few different types or subcategories. There are those people on the front line, the people who are in the presence of another person and actively abusing, exploiting, and coercing them. They might be people who act as slaveholders. They think that they own another person. Or they might be people who control the actions of another person, even though they don't feel a sense of ownership. They're slightly different from a second category, the traffickers as such, the people who move people, who traffic them, who bring them from one place to another, the recruiters, the transporters, the people who run marketplaces where people are sold or where sexual services are sold online. And then the third category I'd like us to consider are the consumers. Now, the consumers of slave services and slave-produced goods. This would include so-called sex tourists and the anonymous viewers of child sexual abuse material online. But it also would include consumers who are further down the line, further down the supply chain, who quite typically don't feel morally responsible for their purchasing choices, but nevertheless, their behaviours, their choices generate the demand that fuels the abuses. And so consumers itself is perhaps a controversial category to put in there. And I'm not saying that all consumers are morally culpable, but that the consumers on the demand side are legitimate targets of the anti-slavery movement. We need to change their behaviours as well. That's why I include them as perpetrators that the movement should be concerned about. Well, what do we know about those perpetrators? What do we know about their demographics, their gender, their age, their nationality? What do we know about their socioeconomic background, their education, their employment, their relative wealth? What do we know about how their backgrounds relate to the backgrounds of their victims? And what do we know about recidivism rates? That is, what do we know about the outcome of punishing an offender? If they go to jail or undergo some other punishment, does that make any difference? Or do they later on go back and repeat the same behaviour as before they were convicted? Now, there's valuable data in court records, in individual case management files, in interviews, in personal experiences that may be part of your own knowledge. But in most cases, the answer to this question is that we know very little. There are some important exceptions. You might be aware of Austin Choi Fitzpatrick's amazing work in India. There was a special edition of the Journal for Human Trafficking in 2016 that focused on traffickers, perpetrators. And there was a special edition of the Anti-Trafficking Review that came out this year, a special edition on traffickers. So there is some work in these areas, but there's a lot of gaps. If we want to change the behaviours of people in those three categories I mentioned before, then we need to know a lot more about them than we do now. So that's my introductory talk, and I now want to ask a couple of questions of you, and then later on there'll be some more questions. At this stage, I'd just like to check that I'm making sense. And so if you have questions of clarification, that something I said didn't make sense, would you like to type that into the Zoom chat window? Please make sure you've got everyone selected so that all of us can see people's comments or questions. I don't want to get into huge justifications of whys and wherefores at this stage, just if you have questions that would help me to clarify what I've said so far, in case there's some ambiguities. Now, at the same time, I'm going to ask Joe to turn on a poll. So what will appear on your screen is a multiple choice question, and I hope it's set up so that you can choose multiple answers. I'm just trying to gauge your background knowledge in this area. So when Joe turns that on, tick a few of the boxes there. And in a couple of minutes, we will see the overall results. Now, look at the chat window here. We look at some of the comments that you can see yourself there. Many trafficked girls become pimps if they can't get out of the system. This is I think the research is showing more and more about how many of the traffickers were themselves victims in the first place. Other people saying, yes, they understand so far. I'm glad if I'm making sense. That's a good sign. But please, if you have any questions of any of my concepts that aren't clear, add something in the chat box. And we'll just give one more minute for people to enter information in the poll, and then we'll show you the results of that. Are people seeing the poll? Someone says they're not seeing it. Did someone put, Helen, are you seeing the poll? Yep. So some people aren't. Any idea there, Joe, why some people aren't seeing the poll?
I don't know. Maybe click on if there's a poll button.
Yeah, perhaps if you move your mouse, a poll button might turn up and you can click on there to see the poll. So there's a question there. My internet went down, but did you differentiate between a trafficker and the recruiters? Yes, I did mention that, and I think that's an important distinction. And the way you would interact with the two categories would be somewhat different, which we'll get to in a moment. Okay, so 35 people out of the 94. That's low. So if anyone else wants to add, we will turn that off in just a minute. Still, some people can't see it. Okay, so Joe, we might end the poll there and show the results. It's clear that not everyone's seeing it, but at least we'll get a rough idea of the trend in people's responses. Can you show that to everyone, Joe? So can people see the results now of the poll? Helen, yeah? Yes, good. So look, the majority of people, 40% anyway, said that they've heard or read about this idea, but not yet taken it any further. A few people have said that their organisation is talking about it, but hasn't engaged with it, put it into action. 21% have said that their organisation in some way engages, perhaps through law enforcement, perhaps through other interventions. So that's good. 21% is consistent with a survey I did 2 years ago. One thing I found from that survey, and this is unprepared, there's a report on that survey on our website if you want to look at it, but part of the thing that came out from that survey is that most organisations don't have a well thought through strategy for dealing with traffickers, but nevertheless, in the course of their work, they do interact with traffickers. They don't have a strong theory of change that takes into account the role of traffickers, but nevertheless, they are working with them. Okay, well, so now let me move on. We'll stop sharing that and back to my PowerPoint slides. We move on to the next section, which is, so how could we possibly do all of this? And I'll move past there. Right. Our own contribution through the Freedom Keys research project until now has been mostly just generating ideas in this space. We've read and we've networked extensively, we've talked with many people, but we haven't yet become involved firsthand in any direct work in the field. And like everything in the anti-trafficking movement, collaboration is key. So in our own work, we're hoping to partner with groups in the field to take some of the ideas that people have suggested and to find ways to pilot them and test their effectiveness. So clearly, human trafficking and modern slavery is a complex and a varied problem. There's no one solution for all contexts. The way you might interact with people who abuse and exploit and coerce others is going to look different depending on many factors. And I list a few here. The way you interact might depend on what type of perpetrator. And I mentioned before, the way I categorize those: slave holders, controllers, recruiters, transporters, market facilitators, consumers. The way you interact will depend on which role the person is taking in that type of classification. Your interaction will also be different depending on what type of slavery it is, what type of abuse, exploitation, or coercion. The way you interact in a context of sexual trafficking won't be the same as how you interact if somebody is conscripting people into a child army. It won't be the same as if you're talking to an owner of a business that's forcing their workers. So the type of exploitation will change the way you interact with people. Thirdly, where in the world are you working? So the cultural context will vary how you interact. An interaction that works in one social context, one culture, can't necessarily be immediately transferred to another culture. So in all of these ways, there is likely to be things that we can learn in one context that might inform what we do in other contexts, but might not be directly transferable. But hopefully we can learn some generalizations from what's done across these spaces that can inform what we do in other spaces. There's one more thing that I think is important, and that is that interactions with perpetrators need to be appropriate to the stage of the perpetrator's life. So for instance, you might do some things before a person even becomes a perpetrator to help guide them in a way that they never do become a perpetrator. So there are some interactions that might be preventative before somebody goes down the wrong path. There are different interactions with people who you know are currently engaged with some form of abuse, exploitation, or coercion. You would interact with them in a different way. And then people who have been accused, convicted, and perhaps in jail, after they've been convicted of some trafficking offence, there'd be a different way of interacting with those people. There might be rehabilitative type processes that you could do while they're in jail. So the type of interaction depends on many things. But given all of that variability, I want to suggest a number of different types of interventions that could be used to try to change perpetrators' behaviour. The first is that we might try to avert the behaviour in the first place. We could do this by reducing the vulnerability of people to becoming human traffickers. If we understood why some people choose that route and the person living next door to them in the same community decides not to, if we knew what that difference was, then we could perhaps avert the problem before it gets off the ground. Poverty reduction and all the other things that reduce the vulnerability of victims to becoming victims might be just as effective at reducing the vulnerability of people to becoming perpetrators, but that needs further study. A second strategy might be to try to deter people, to scare them off, to threaten punishment, to engage in some name and shame process. A well-advertised and resourced set of legal consequences might deter people from getting involved because the risk becomes too high. Another strategy might be to try to block people. Now, by blocking, I mean putting a barrier up so that they just cannot do what they want to do. It takes them out of the picture, in some way using a greater force to prevent them from acting, making the abuse, the exploitation too difficult or too expensive for them to consider. Some areas in this type of strategy might be the vigilance that we've seen some organisations using at trafficking, at travel hubs. So if we're alert and we see something that looks like a potential trafficking situation, someone can step in and prevent it before it gets too far. The requirements for documentation for transporting minors overseas, which many countries now have, is a really useful blocker to that type of trafficking. Putting people in jail is an effective form of blocking, because while they're in jail, they can no longer continue the abuse or exploitation or coercion that they were doing before. My fourth suggestion is that we could subvert the behaviour of traffickers. That is, we don't stop their action, we leave their action as it is, but we do things to reduce or undermine the effect of their action, to reduce their impact. One example of this that I came across in Hong Kong is a group called the Fair Employment Foundation. They're an employment agency which brings migrants into Hong Kong to act as domestic workers. And their approach is to create a best practice model which is commercially successful, that treats migrants as they should be treated, with dignity and fairness. But to do that in a way that's visible to all the other employment agencies that might be doing things exploitatively. That's a tricky word to get my mouth around, exploitatively. And so the idea there is, by showing a model of something that works, which is best practice and profitable, it puts pressure on all the other organizations to lift their game. So it doesn't stop them doing what they're doing, but it subversively causes them, for commercial reasons, to have to do better than what they're doing. Another option would be to redirect, that is to provide alternatives. So if someone who is thinking about doing some form of trafficking or is already involved, they do so for some reasons. They've got some pressure on them, some external drivers, and they've got some internal psychological motivation. There's something that's making them do that. Maybe we can redirect those drivers and motivation to give them other alternatives. Perhaps if they had a decent paying job in a valuable situation, then they wouldn't have to be engaged with trafficking if profit is their motive. Perhaps we need to provide rehabilitation in prisons. I haven't come across anyone in the world who's doing rehabilitation specifically for traffickers, for people convicted of trafficking offences. Please let me know if you're aware of any. Wouldn't it be great if some ex-perpetrators, once they come out of prison, go back to their communities as advocates for change within their home community? That would be a great way of redirecting not only the one person's motivational ecology, but using them as advocates to redirect other people in their home communities. The sixth one I'll mention here is removing demand. And so if we work at the consumer level, trying to change the behaviour of consumers through consumer education, or if we do the supply chain auditing that is becoming more common practice, those things can remove the demand for slave-generated goods and services, and so the traffickers haven't got a market to serve. Okay, now I skipped over them fairly quickly, and what I want to do now is ask you whether you've got some ideas on these, and I want to do this in two ways, so just bear with me in a minute. I want to ask, what examples can you think of these 6 intervention categories? So just pause and think for a minute. Maybe there's something you're already doing, maybe there's something you've seen, maybe there's something that comes to mind that could be tried in any of these areas. And I want to engage your ideas, as I said at the beginning, using a reverse order of speaking. So there are 2 ways that you can respond here. You're more than welcome to write a brief idea in the chat and everybody can see it. But I'd also like people to have the opportunity of speaking. And so if you want to use the Zoom feature to raise your hand, I think that's on the reactions menu there. If you raise your hand, Joe or I hopefully will see it, and we can nominate someone to unmute. I'm only interested here in short responses to this particular question, examples that you can think of for these intervention categories. I want to invite people who normally don't speak first to raise their hand first. The ones who are always jumping in first, I ask you to be patient and wait for a little while. So please either type something in chat, make sure you've selected everyone so we all see it, or raise your hand and we'll give you a minute to make a contribution verbally. Can you see any hands, Joe? I can't see any at the moment.
Don't be shy.
Yeah, don't be shy.
Also, we have interpretation, so if English is not comfortable, that is okay.
Thank you. Yes, yes. So there's a comment there from Hollis Chai. I wonder what shaming could fit in the categories. For instance, community creates dramas to ridicule traffickers. Yep, I think shaming is a way to deter people. But maybe fits in other categories too, but in deter, it's something that will make people ashamed to do something and therefore deter them from doing it. How would you do an assessment, monitoring and evaluation in these types of interventions? That's a good question. There's a question just before that from Jarawat. If somebody could translate that for us into English, that'd be great. But this one here, how would you do assessment, monitoring and evaluation? Yeah, and that's going to vary depending on what your intervention looks like and the type of perpetrator that you're engaged in. It could be done by some before and after attitude surveys. You could be interviewing some people in your space, asking about their attitudes, why they're doing what they're doing, and then doing some intervention that tries to educate them or threatens them with punishment or whatever the intervention is, and then repeating the questionnaire afterwards through an interview or printed questionnaire to see if their attitude was changed. You could be looking at recidivism rates as another way of measuring how effective you've done here. In fact, that's a whole area that I think is understudied. I haven't seen any published results that show how many people who are convicted of trafficking go back to the same work afterwards, and how many people change. But again, if you had that sort of statistics, did some intervention, and then check whether those statistics changed over time, that would be another way. So yeah, I think there's a whole variety of assessment monitoring techniques, but they depend on exactly what type of intervention you're doing. So there's a comment here from Claudia. I believe cleaning accountability framework is an example of subverting the acceptance of exploitative cleaning work, similar to the Fair Employment Agency. So I don't know the cleaning accountability framework. That would be a good one to get some more details on. Claudia, if you've got a link for us that points to more detail on that, that might be useful. Thanks, that was quick. Angela says, from what I know, TSA in Uganda is working with restorative justice together with law enforcement, especially for recruiters. Yep, people who might come from the same community as the survivors. Yeah, look, I think that's important. The restorative justice techniques, I think, are important area for us to consider with people who have been convicted of trafficking offences. I think myself that just punishment is not an effective way to resolve the problem, and that techniques in restorative justice give equal responsibility onto the perpetrator, but provide a more positive way forward rather than just punishment. Okay, well, thanks for those inputs. There'll be other chances to give some input later, but let me move forward to a second question that you might like to contribute to. Whoops, I missed. And that is this one. What barriers make these interventions difficult? So I'm not sure how much you are now convinced that these would be good things to try, but why is it that they don't get tried all that frequently? What is it that stops us doing it? Are they not going to work? Do people not have the skills, the funding? What, in your experience personally and with your organisation, why is it that these type of interventions to avert, deter, subvert, what were my others? Redirect, block, remove demand. Why don't we do more of those things? And I'm not saying none of it happens. There are some initiatives in all of those spaces. Why don't we see more of it? Once again, if you want to type something in chat, if you want to speak for a minute or less, please raise your hand and we can unmute you. Now, I'm trying to give people the chance who normally don't speak to speak up. But if nobody's speaking up, then I will give permission to the vocal people to speak as well. So anyone who's the extrovert who's always got an answer, I give you permission to talk now. So some other comments coming in. Ruth talks about Stop the Traffic, their success with giving pamphlets to tourists arriving at the Soccer World Cup. That's a good one. I heard a recent one about somebody, you might be able to remind me who it was, but put together a short video of boyfriend trafficking, and they distribute that short video on buses. So people who are sitting on a bus going on a long distance trip might accidentally look up and see a television talking about the risk of being trafficked by a supposed boyfriend. And they might think, oh, maybe that's me. And they might go and talk to the bus driver and rescue themselves from a tricky situation. So behaviour change is very challenging and takes resources, time, which sometimes doesn't fit the goals of the funding organisations. Yeah, I think that's a key one. Often a lot of anti-trafficking organisations themselves have a particular mandate, a particular space in which they work, and working with perpetrators is outside that mandate, so that it's not their core competency. But related to that is that they might have trouble getting any funders to give them the funding to build resources to address that area, even if they wanted to. So getting the funders to understand that projects interacting with traffickers is a valuable initiative and that could be funded. To have a funding category for that type of intervention would be useful. Less evidence of best practice hinders funding opportunities. Yep. The traffickers are in a pit. They've disregarded moral standards altogether anyway. So all this time punishment seemed to be the best and efficient option. So yep. So we come from a lot of societies where punishment is the default way of dealing with misdemeanors, crimes, abuses. It seems the well-traveled road, seems the easiest way, the most efficient. Well, we need to measure if it really is as efficient as we might think it is. How effective is it in stemming the underlying problem? The perceived or real fear or danger of getting involved with traffickers in some contexts is a barrier. That's a good point as well. Traffickers tend to be rather nasty people, and so exposing yourself to those people may put yourself at risk. That can certainly be a barrier, the personal safety aspect. And then Sophia writes, from the perspective of prevention, when we do activities with rights holders, it's good to keep in mind that both possible victims and possible perpetrators are in the same community. This does not create a lot of risk to staff, I believe, when engaging people that are already engaged in illicit activities, illegal activities. This could be more risky and could jeopardize the safety of staff. Yeah. Yeah, I think people who have already got programs that are engaged at grassroots awareness raising and prevention, particularly groups that maybe have a school program that warn people about the dangers that they might experience and how to protect themselves, how to build resilience. It would be great to see those syllabuses also including something that calls out the best of those children in their aspirations for growing up. To ask those children, who do you want to become when you grow up? Do you want to become one of the people who abuses, exploits, and coerces the others around you? Or will you be the kind of person who stands for human dignity and human rights and protects not only yourself, but protects the people around you as well? And at that point, we might be able to avert people moving into the trafficking direction, because from an early age, they're making personal commitments to be a better kind of person than that. Lastly here, in the short term, it's easy to turn a blind eye and to put it in the too hard basket or think, I won't make a difference. Yeah, this does seem like a huge problem, overwhelmingly big, and perhaps just too daunting, too hard to get involved. And that leads me nicely into how I want to spend some time in the last part of the talk. Where are we up to? Oh, we've got plenty of time. And that is what to do next. What to do next. So the suggestions that we've been talking about to encourage and understand and engage with perpetrators in order to change their behavior can seem completely overwhelming, even impossibly huge. And I do think that that's one of the reasons why we haven't got much traction in this space. So in the interest of trying to make it a little bit simpler, it seems to me that no one person or organization can do it all. And so we need to collaborate around some sort of framework that breaks this massive task down into manageable tasks. And that's what I want to try to present now. You probably all know how to eat an elephant. You eat them one small piece at a time. We can't eat this whole elephant of changing perpetrators' behaviors, but maybe there's ways of breaking it down into manageable tasks, one task at a time. Well, how might we do that? We've already discussed various types of perpetrator. I mentioned these categories before: slaveholders, controllers, traffickers, transporters, marketers, and consumers of various sorts. That in itself splits the elephant into three sections, and we can think about the opportunities and challenges in each of those three areas of intervention. Well, I also talked about taking note of when we do the interaction, depending on the life cycle of the perpetrator. One of the first things that we can be doing is the foundational analysis. What data do we have on who the perpetrators are, how they work, why they do what they do, what external pressures and what internal motivations cause that behavior? So there's work to be done in that space. And then those three that I've given you before, during, after, there are different interventions and different ideas to generate and test in each of those spaces. Now, if we put those two things together, we get a matrix with 12 cells, and there is work to be done in each of those cells. So, for instance, in this one here, I've highlighted one task is going to be to gather data about the consumers of online sexual abuse of children. Who is it that makes the demand side active in OSEC? That in itself could be helpful information. Who are they? Where do they come from? What drives their destructive behavior? Another example over here, before a person becomes a perpetrator, before they become a slaveholder or a controller, we might implement interventions that challenge people at an early age to think who they want to become. In that example I gave before, how might we prevent them from choosing to become, say, an exploitative business owner? And then, of course, we would need to find ways to test that idea, to measure it, to understand how effective that idea was. Another task is going to be to work with people in prison who have been convicted of trafficking or selling people or selling slave services or goods while in prison. we want to measure the recidivism rate to see whether those interventions are effective or not. So they're just a few examples. And so now I want to throw a question back to you again. If you were to contribute, or if your organisation was to do something in any of these spaces, which cell in the matrix or which area might you already be involved in? Might you already have data in? Or might you be interested in testing, trying, promoting in your organisation? So once again, if you have an answer to this, you can raise your hand and you can speak for a little while, or put an idea in the chat box. I'm going to be making sure I get a record of everything in that chat box so that we can follow things up later. And I'll give you opportunities in the last 5 minutes to engage with me further if this is raising your interest and you would like more information. We'll come to that in a moment. But please, if you have responses to this question, type something in the chat box or raise your hand in Zoom. What might you already be aware of, or where might you be able to or interested in contributing? Even if they're wild ideas. So someone's written in the chat there are situations where the traffickers or pimps and the local authorities, say the local police, for instance, are hand in glove behind the screen or behind the scene, maybe, for mutual selfish gain. If so, how do you deal with such situations to address the whole trafficking issue? Yep, the corruption of law enforcement is an important aspect. In that case, the law enforcement agents themselves become perpetrators. They become supporters that enable it to happen. And so, yep, there's a whole area of interventions. How do we train police in dealing with trafficking situations ethically? How do we do that in a way that protects the safety of victims and survivors? How do we do it in a way where law enforcement people are on the lookout for their peers who might be open to corruption, and what's the response channel if they do that? So there's a training issue to be done there. And also that same question, who do you want to be? Do you want to be one of those people who gains from somebody else's exploitation? Is that really the best of humanity in you, or can we draw out something better of you as a law enforcement officer? So, yep, there's things to be done in that area as well. Someone said that they would get involved in the consumer side. I've seen increasing work in that space, not just auditing supply chains, but directly engaging with consumers, trying to change consumer behaviours so that people buy differently, so that people are aware of the trafficking implications of what they buy. And I'm particularly interested in the area of OSEC and the perpetrators, the demand side of that. Who are the people? They're typically middle-aged males in relatively rich countries that are paying for online abuse, often live streamed, of people in poorer countries, particularly from my understanding in the Philippines, but certainly other places as well. What drives those people? What's the sexual pathology that's driving them to engage in that type of abuse, that remote anonymous abuse, which is so traumatic and life-changing, life-threatening for the people that they abuse without even being in the same room as them? But what is it that's driving that demand? What should we be doing to challenge, to educate, to redirect those motivations of those particular consumers? How do we identify those people? How do we find them online and then somehow engage with them to say, you know, is this really what you want to be doing? Do you know the full impact of what you're doing here? And it might involve threats of punishment and all sorts of things, but how do we engage with those people to subvert or redirect those motivations? Emma has asked, am I aware of any training done in law enforcement or police in this area? It's not my area of expertise. I do understand that International Justice Mission does a fair bit of education of police in the Philippines, particularly around this online sexual abuse. So that's one area. That's the only example that I'm aware of, but perhaps others can add a comment there. And then the last comment there at the moment, can't stop thinking about what you said regarding this and the fact that no one's doing it, reaching the perpetrators after conviction in prison. How amazingly effective that could be. Yeah, look, there's lots of people who do rehabilitation work with prisoners. I just haven't seen anyone who targets trafficking offenders. That wouldn't maybe take an existing process, an existing program of intervention in prisons, but tailors it to the type of people and the psychology and the sentencing regime for people who are in there for trafficking offences. I haven't come across anyone who's particularly doing that, and therefore we have no idea about how effective it is because we don't know if anyone's even trying it. Helen says there are orgs in Cambodia working with this too. Do you mean with the police, Helen? Yeah, working with police. Yep. Once again, there's a comment I can't read. If someone could translate that to English, that'd be great. Perhaps that's what the next comment is. In our country's context, there is involvement, carelessness of police officials in human trafficking. Yep, I think many countries have that problem. Angela says in 2016, I know that one criminology lecturer from the University of Sunshine Coast, that's in Australia, yay, working on a helpline project for paedophiles. She was trying to get support from the government for that time. Yeah, I've seen a couple of peer support groups for paedophiles, which I don't know how effective they are, but that kind of thing is important in the same way as Alcohol Anonymous and those other addictive behaviour support groups can prevent the problem by helping people to deal with their own proclivities to whatever addiction they have, including paedophilia and other sexual dysfunctions. Joseph says a Thai comment is, this is the translation, confirming that there are also law enforcement involved in corruption in Thailand. Yeah. Dear Matthew, do you think human trafficking is a structural problem? Yeah, look, I do. That's an important question. Look, there could be a long conversation about what type of problem human trafficking is. Is it a moral problem? Is it a criminal problem? Is it a public health problem? Is it a structural problem? Where does the difference between structure and agency come together? I want to say that people who are involved in trafficking offences, in abusing, coercing, and exploiting other people, make choices. They have agency, they have moral responsibility, and yet there are external pressures that drive those behaviours. There are pressures to survive, there is poverty, there is lack of alternatives, there are structural issues in political, economic systems that drive exactly the kind of behaviours that we see. Our global capitalism creates a situation where cheap or unpaid labour is almost essential for the survival of many businesses. And so there are structural reasons why this happens, and they need to be addressed as well. So there is structural issues, but there is also a relational issue. There is people who are abusing other people, and that's a breakdown in relationship. That's a breakdown in what, in Jewish terminology, shalom. It breaks peace, it breaks human dignity, it breaks the sense of wholeness, respect, and coherency in society. So it is all of those issues. Yep, it is many issues. And then the last comment before I move on, yeah, instead of putting perpetrators in jail, the police protect them, and they have connections and are gaining money from the trade. Yep, that's true, and that definitely needs addressing, perhaps through particular interventions that that specifically and explicitly target the reduction of corruption amongst law enforcement agents. So lots of good comments there. I'll move on to just the last bit, and then we'll have an open time for any other questions you want to throw my way before the end of the hour. As I said before, look, collaboration is key. And so when I think about what might happen next, I want to pose these questions to you to see how interested you are in getting involved further. Would you like to be kept informed about the work that's done in this space? Are you aware of initiatives that I haven't been aware of? Any research reports, any programs in the field, any data that your organization might have? Whether that data is qualitative, it might be some interviews that you did with a particular perpetrator. It might be some survey that you did in your area. It might be some notes that you have on a particular situation that reveal something about the nature of the perpetrator's side of the problem. Would you like to be involved in projects that collect further data? Do you have any ideas about how to test the interventions that we've been talking about in any of the cells of the matrix? Lots of things that I'd like to invite you into. If any of those resonate with you, if you'd like to be involved, then please contact me. I'm more than happy to be a sort of a collation point that spreads the information around. If anyone has stuff that they want to share with others, I'm happy to collect information and make it available to others. Part of my career was in knowledge management. I think I do a reasonable job of collecting dispersed, disparate, disconnected information and making it into a form that can be analysed and accessible to other people. So please contact me. If you want to find out more about the project that I'm doing, our website there is turningteardropsintojoy.com. You can find me on LinkedIn. And if you want to see some of my research outputs, publications are all listed on the OrcID website there. So that's all I wanted to say. And I'll just open things up now for a few minutes. We haven't got too long, but 5 minutes. If anyone wants to throw some tricky questions at me or make any other comments, please do. Nothing forthcoming there. I've stunned you all into silence or something. I hope I've generated some ideas for you. Excuse me. And please do stay in touch so that we can work together around this issue. It's big and complex, as the whole of human trafficking. Modern slavery is huge and complex, but working together, sharing information, sharing our experience, we're all hopeful that we can make some inroads into this horrendous social problem. So thanks for being part of the call. I'll make sure, Joe, can you grab a copy of the chat? And I'll have a look at doing that as well. And please stay in touch. Contact me on email if you want to be involved.
Yeah, just to say thank you so much. I probably, like with everybody else, their heads are spinning with all of this amazing information. Just to let everybody know that this PowerPoint will be available as well as the recording of this session. So you can go and rewatch it over and over again. And I really appreciate the kind of that matrix. It really makes it very practical and challenges each one of us into action. So thank you for this amazing session. And we will be taking a 15-minute break before the next breakout session. So time to grab yourself a coffee or a cup of tea and then sit down for the next few sessions. So thank you again. See you in 15 minutes.
Thanks, Helen. Thanks, everyone.